back to the Wellness Check. Today we are going to be talking about what is PTSD. What is trauma? Let's actually define these things for what they are and begin to look past the stereotypes that they might hold for each and every one of us as individuals. What is PTSD? What does it stand for? What is trauma? What does that mean to you when you hear the word trauma? Well, let me start maybe with the word trauma. As a trauma therapist, that word is constantly coming out of my mouth in this office. And one of the most common responses I get is, but what do you mean trauma? I have not been to war. I have not seen an environmental disaster. Like, I have never been assaulted. I'm not traumatized. Well, let's really look at what trauma means and how to define it in more of a realistic fashion that we all can identify with. Trauma is something that actually none of us can avoid. We will experience it in our lifetime, and it doesn't have to be something as glaringly obvious as deployment and war and all of those things. To put it in perspective, and I've used this example before in another video, being born and being brought into this world is traumatic. We are in our mother's womb, we are safe and cozy and warm, we're getting all of our nutrients whenever we need it, and then we are born into the world under fluorescent lights, and it's cold, and we have to start figuring out how to breathe on our own. It's a very different environment than we have ever experienced before then. So right there, right out of the gate, we can identify, we've all been born if we're here, that was a traumatizing experience. So that's maybe something that's universal to use as an example. But there are lots of other different types of trauma too. In the field of trauma, we talk about what's called big T and little t trauma. Big T trauma would be those things that we discussed, the glaringly obvious, the military person sent to war, the first responder going to a really tough call, sexual assault, sexual abuse, verbal abuse. Those things we could all agree that those would be traumatic. But what about the smaller things? What about the little T's? You know, we all at some point will lose someone that we care about. They will pass away, whether that's a family member, whether that's a friend, whether that's a pet. We will all study really hard for a test, and we might fail. We thought we did really well, and we failed. Maybe you were bullied in school. Maybe someone's going through a divorce. Maybe there's a developmental trauma somewhere in someone's lifespan. Maybe the family of origin, someone's mother and father did not take the best care of a child. And that can kind of go on the spectrum of big T or little t. We are impervious to trauma. It's going to happen. It will happen to us at one point for the rest of humanity. And I'm not trying to scare you into it or scare you with the word trauma or that something bad is going to happen. What I'm saying is that this is a universal experience. And I'm here to talk about how trauma affects us, how it affects the brain, and once the brain is affected by something that is traumatic, what happens then? And why is there such thing available as trauma or brain-based therapy, or what I call limbic system therapy? So this is how it ties into everything else. What is PTSD? If we experience something really little, does that mean we have PTSD? If we experience something really big, does that mean we have PTSD? No, actually not. People can go through really big T's. I'm kind of using that lingo now, if you can kind of catch on to that. Really big T traumas and come away without being traumatized. People can go through little t traumas and come out very traumatized. PTSD criteria. How do we know if someone has PTSD, given whatever experience they go through? Well, here are some signs that we might be experiencing PTSD. One thing that we look for as trauma therapists and clinicians, we look at the experience of flashbacks, nightmares. Flashbacks are things that happen typically during our waking hours, where they're an intrusive thought, image, memory, scent, smell, sound come into our mind that reminds us very much so of that scary negative event. And it kind of propels us into that event again, making us feel really unregulated. It makes us feel as though we were there again. Same thing with nightmares. It's very, very common for people that go through something really activating to have nightmares, certainly after the event as their mind is trying to process everything, but maybe even years and years to come. I can do a whole nother video on what dreams mean and our unconscious mind constantly trying to repair and catalog and file things away. That's part of the process of nightmares, albeit very uncomfortable and distressing. We also tend to be pretty avoidant. So let's just say, one of my favorite go-tos to use as an example is a motor vehicle accident. We might avoid going to that intersection. We might avoid driving in front of an 18-wheeler. We might avoid or feel scared if you hear the squeal of brakes around you. We tend to avoid all of those things as a safety mechanism because it just reminds us too much of the event itself. We also tend to be really hypervigilant, and that's a big word, meaning that we are on the edge of our seat. We are scanning our environment consciously and unconsciously, waiting for the next bad thing to happen. And this manifests itself in many ways. That could be, I can't trust my judgment. I make bad choices. Or I can't trust other people's judgment. I don't know people's intentions for me. This doesn't feel safe. So now maybe we're talking about isolation, social anxiety, unhealthy relationships, and patterns in relationships. All of that has to do with hypervigilance. And it's your brain saying, hey, do you remember that one time this really bad thing happened? I'm going to do everything I can to try and prevent that from happening again. And in order to do so, I'm going to stay on overdrive. I'm going to work relentlessly to make sure that you are safe. That's really what's happening in our brain. That limbic system, that middle core of your brain cannot turn off because there's no indication to your brain that that's a safe or healthy thing to do. It is red lights flashing, sirens blaring, we've got to keep you safe. So these are kind of the main characteristics of what PTSD are. Studies have shown that it takes around 3 or so months for the brain to kind of process some really distressing material. So we have an acute phase of distress and traumatic experiences, and then we have this chronic one that after 3 months, if we are really still suffering, we are distressed, we are experiencing avoidance, hypervigilance, social anxieties, you name it, then we might want to look at this chronic or more complex definition of PTSD. Whether it's something acute, which just means here in the moment, maybe more short term, or chronic, there are still interventions that we can use to help calm the limbic system down. Introduction right here to limbic system therapies, brain system therapies, the things that I talk about in all of my videos about and how they're so different than just your normal talk therapy type environment. My philosophy is if the limbic system, the middle core of your brain, is the part that is struggling to regulate, it feels like it's in danger, it can't anticipate the next step, we are really, really stressed, then that's the part of the brain we need to talk to. Our midbrain, our limbic system, and our prefrontal cortex, this big bulbous part up here, they do not communicate very well with one another. And in fact, when they're under stress, they don't really communicate at all together. So if your midbrain, your limbic system, is lit up and really, really looking for safety, then we've got to speak to that part of the brain. And that's why things like Brainspotting and EMDR exist. Those therapies speak to that part of the brain. That, and there are lots of other tips and resources that one can learn from a trauma-informed therapist to help bring down that central nervous system activity. I teach all my clients a breadth of resources that they can use day to day to help regulate and calm down that nervous system. And it's an amazing thing. To even just give you a peek into how complex the brain is, and even the most, I don't know what you'd call it, the most studied brain experts, scientists in the entire world, still don't know everything. So to put it in perspective, the brain has 1 to 4 quadrillion synaptic connections. David Grand, the inventor, founder of Brainspotting, says that 4 quadrillion, that's more brain synapses than stars in the universe. And from another training I went to for Brainspotting, one of the trainers said, 4 quadrillion, let's learn to quantify that. If you had 4 Olympic-sized pools, imagine that, just 4 Olympic-sized pools in front of you, and each of those pools was filled up to the top with grains of sand. Each grain of sand would be one of those synaptic connections. Imagine that. It's almost just too enormous to even quantify it all. That is how complex our brains are. So imagine going through something that disrupts peace and harmony in your mind and in your body and in your nervous system. All of the synapses and the domino effect that could have on how your brain processes, how it begins to see and sense the world around you, right? That's why we don't feel safe. That's why we're waiting for the next bad thing to happen, etc. So the brain therapies, what do they do? In a nutshell, what we do is, again, we speak to this part of the brain, this middle part of the brain, the limbic system. We tap into that. And inside of that is the experience, the traumatic event. Connected to that are the feelings, right? The feelings of fear, the feelings of shame, the feelings of embarrassment, panic. Connected to that, we have core beliefs. Coming away from something like that, we develop these beliefs of, I'm in danger, I'm not okay as I am, I should have done something, I'm stupid, right? We have these beliefs that are now also tied into the feelings and the event. And those 3 big things for each event that we go through tend to kind of multiply themselves throughout your lifespan. So if that negative core belief is, I'm in danger, then that's kind of like the lens of which we see our world. We're looking through our lens, given our experiences, our feelings, and our beliefs, the world around us, and that's how we perceive. So you can begin to see the amount of disruption in one's life, the amount of suffering and struggle in one's life after going through something, whether it was a one-time trauma or whether this was multiplied over the course of someone's life. How disruptive this can be. And thank goodness for brain therapies, for limbic system therapies. What we do is we take that limbic system, we take that memory, we take those attached things, and we literally make a new baby neural pathway in your brain to help process, to help systematically file away those experiences where they're supposed to go. They're causing the disruption because they're stuck. They were so overwhelming and so upsetting that our brain had to hold on to them for a safety mechanism. So once we teach someone how to regulate, how to understand their symptoms of anxiety and panic and depression and OCD and all of that, then we can, after that foundation is laid, then we can tap in safely and appropriately to that limbic system where all the stuck stuff is. How many of you have ever said, I just feel so stuck? Let's take a look at what's in there. It wants to be filed. It wants to be healed. It wants to be desensitized, so to speak. And that's what Brainspotting and EMDR do. Helps to flow that process through on a neurobiological level, creating new synapses, creating new neurological pathways to make that happen. I know, it just sounds too good to be true. And that's why clinicians that do this work are so jazzed up about it. It's a really, really cool thing. What's also something to consider is that these therapies are designed to not re-traumatize you. Sometimes sitting there and thinking about it or getting in that ruminating cycle is very unhelpful, and it puts us more in a state of panic. It can re-traumatize. Sometimes talking about it over and over feels really unhelpful, and now we just feel even more activated or more hopeless. These therapies are designed to keep you feeling regulated throughout the entire experience. So as your mind is doing this work and doing this processing, you are feeling as connected and composed as possible. So that's something else to think about. Sometimes I worry that as I talk about trauma therapy, people fear that they're just going to be re-traumatized. And that is a lot of the work that we try to prevent from happening. Okay? That's really the whole point of this, is to not re-traumatize you. So I hope you learned a little something about what trauma is, to look at your own definitions and maybe stereotypes of what trauma is, maybe to look at it on a more general and universal level, to look at acute versus chronic trauma, to look at a one incident traumatic event versus a complex or chronic traumatic event, to look at what PTSD is, to know the signs and symptoms, and most importantly, what to do about it, how to go about seeking your healing journey, who to look for in terms of a therapist, and how these brain-based therapies can really, really make a difference. Okay, thank you for tuning in and checking in with your wellness. Have a great day. I'll see you soon.